Let's preface this by saying that what I'm about to present was largely conceived in a lot more of an analytic context, and so I think because of that, there's going to be some parts that are going to be rather elementary for this audience, but a lot more new and striking for other contexts. And so because of that, if there's some parts that are not snooze fests, but that are a bit more basic, then forgive me. Regardless, I'd like to begin uh, by bringing up this one quotation that I kind of read randomly. But when I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, like I feel like this is very true. This is from the beginning of Vincent Edward Smith's St. Thomas on the Object of Geometry. And I won't read through all of it. I'm sure you are all literate, but um, I like it very much because I think it highlights some like an intuition or just sort of an idea that was in the back of my mind throughout, reading through Aristotle and Frege and thinking about, philosophy of mathematics and how to do philosophy of mathematics, and basically this idea of like, oh, how easy it is for us to mistake mathematics for being something it isn't, or for thinking that, oh, mathematics will get us something that it actually cannot get us, or which it can only give us like sort of a hollow shell or a phantasm or whatever of what we're actually searching for. But so with that in mind, basically my point or my general point is going to be that there's kind of two ways to, well, obviously more than two ways, but there's multiple ways in which we can kind of go about doing philosophy of mathematics in the first place. And there's going to be one way that I think is exemplified by Aristotle, and for lack of a better term, just call it like the metaphysical way of doing it, where it's like you basically, despite mathematics being a super important science or being one of the most theoretical sciences, at the end of the day, when we do the philosophy of mathematics, that's going to have to take place in a metaphysical context. Right, and I think this is even just like obvious from the layout of the metaphysics, where we don't get into like the real meat of Aristotle's philosophy of mathematics till books Mu and New, which can be at like the very end, after we've already done investigations into, being and imperceptible substances and whatnot. Right. And so then every time he, talks about the philosophy of mathematics is going to be contained within this metaphysical framework and with this metaphysical context. And then in contrast to that, there's going to be um, Frege. I have this quotation from the Metaphysics, which I think um, exemplifies this or kind of shows this. But then we contrast this with Frege, and for Frege, rather than it at least explicitly being in a metaphysical context, what he wants to do, and again, this is like pretty basic Frege, is going to be saying like, no, actually, let's try to, mathematics is this analytic a priori science, and we are going to be deducing numbers and mathematics from pure logic. It's going to be the more this just like logico. And so the philosophy of mathematics is going to be, this logico-mathematical endeavor wherein we define numbers as, sets of a certain kind and, so on and so forth. And with this latter one, I'm going to take issue with in favor of sort of more of the Aristotelian one. And the primary reason for this is going to be that basically that in order to even do or to make sense of Frege's logical mathematical method, you're going to have to presuppose some metaphysical truths or a certain metaphysical framework, such that, at the end of the day, no matter how you try to go about doing the philosophy of mathematics, you're going to have some kind of metaphysical background. And the only then difference being is the extent to which you're honest about that, or the extent to which, you actually reason about your metaphysical claims as opposed to just sort of presupposing them without any way to argue about them. And so then with that in mind, this is going to be the basic gist of what I'll be talking about. First, I'm going to be talking about sort of seeing the issue from Frege's perspective and sort of showing why in fact, he does have to make certain metaphysical presuppositions. And this is, for context, um, this is going to involve a discussion of like, Platonism and Plato and Frege and how they're related to each other, especially since later on I'll be dealing with Aristotle, some of it, what Aristotle says against Platonism. And so because of that, I want to make sure like, we have everything that we need to make sense of them. Um, right. So then after I talk about Frege for a bit, I'll talk about some of what Aristotle talks about, particularly from books Mu and New, but also drawing from other places. And I'm going to be largely focusing on sort of stuff Aristotle says about causation with respect to numbers, and how, this will sort of just even to defend himself against something like this, Frege would have to appeal to metaphysics or some metaphysical ideas, as well as just some comments on the nature of sciences and how Aristotle conceives of it, um, and which further just shows how limited Frege is and what he's talking about. I think sort of these ideas with Aristotle in general sort of are a complement to what I'll say about Frege and why he relies on metaphysics, because it almost, in a certain sense, shows like, oh, from a perspective beyond Frege, it helps explain why he runs into these problems, which sort of can be found even just from looking at Frege without himself, without respect to any sort of outside Aristotelian framework. Then after talking about Aristotle's arguments, I'll go into a bit into very briefly about the Aristotelian conception of science, nothing too new for all of y'all. And then sort of then applying it to Frege, then concluding from there. I'll note that as opposed to say other, you know, rather straightforward, anti-Fregean arguments or something, this isn't. I'm kind of working on different levels, right? I'm kind of right because dealing with sort of what Frege thinks about the ontology of number. I'll also be dealing with the method, as well as just like the nature of scientific knowledge. And so, in a certain sense, this my remarks will be somewhat scattered, or at least not super, in depth on one particular thing. But I think that's sort of going to be a requirement to given the nature of philosophy, especially if you do it at a certain foundational level. Anyway, so beginning with my first part on Frege and Plato and Platonism. Um, there's a certain thought that like, oh, like this is almost like too obvious. Like, why even talk about this in the first place, given how Platonistic Frege seems to be, right? There's this quotation from Dummett that I think shows this. Like, reading this, it like makes Frege seem as though he's like just like a Platonist, just as Plato was. However, I think if we want to understand how exactly the arguments I'm going to be dealing with, both with respect to Frege as well as with respect to Aristotle, fit together, I think it's going to be necessary for us to know what exactly people are talking about when we say that Frege is in fact a Platonist. And of course, right, when Aristotle's criticizing Plato himself, he's not like criticizing him for being a Platonist, right? He's criticizing him for specific reasons that are involved with, being a Platonist and the specific beliefs of Platonism. Right. And so then if that mind, if to claim then that Frege is a Platonist is simply an oversimplification of the views and that in fact there's no real coherence between them or no similarities between them, then um to simply use or raise Aristotle's arguments against Frege would be kind of to miss the mark. Right. And so uh and so in the beginning, just like looking at Plato. So thinking about what exactly Plato thought about numbers, or just about object generally, here's some more quotations from the dialogues, right? This idea of, again, basic Platonism, just these uncreated and indestructible objects that are imperceptible, accessed only by the intellect as opposed to the senses, you know, something that's eternal, something that subsists on itself. These are the kinds of things that, or these are the how we would describe Platonistic objects for Plato. And we see then sort of in other places like such qualities being um, directly identified or applied to numbers themselves, these in like, the third realm and then, floating around or whatever in heaven. And this is sort of the basic metaphysical Platonist view of what numbers are. And right, and the reason why Plato asserts these or one reason why you search these objects is basically the idea that, oh, if we, even want to do mathematics in the first place, in order to make sense of mathematics, then that requires us to assume that there's like certain objects that these mathematical claims are about. And since obviously those mathematical claims can't be physical, or psychological or anything because of the fact that, they're eternally true, 1 plus 1 is always going to equal 2, and so on and so forth, then it would seem to follow that these kinds of objects similarly have to be eternal and, unchanging and nonsensible and so on and so forth. And so then just from that quick gloss over Plato, it would seem like, Frege, fits the bill. Like, oh yeah, this is also what Frege thinks. Right? He mentions, a third realm must be recognized. He says this in thought, by the way. So he talks about this third realm and talks about the thought expressed by the Pythagorean theorem being timelessly true, independently of any particular person. Likewise, he also speaks about in the foundations of arithmetic how like numbers or the objects of arithmetic are going to be these things that um, aren't known by like the senses, like, because they act on us or anything, but because we just directly know them through the intellect, right? Again, sounds relatively Platonistic. And so then likewise, then later on, he talks about, you know, these kinds of objects not being, wirklich or, actual or real. And his Dummett clarifies in his book on Frege's philosophy of mathematics. Um, Such an object is only going to be wirklich if it's a causal agent. So Frege is going to say that, oh, these objects aren't causal agents, they aren't going around pushing or pulling things or whatever, which again sort of makes us think of these things, oh, like maybe they're floating around or whatever. It's like, oh, However, um, despite all this, and despite how similar Frege might sound to Plato, I think it'd be a little hasty to then just say, oh, well then, all set. We can just, aim our Aristotelian cannons at Frege and then, fire away. Because there's going to be sort of an important difference that if you sort of read a bit more closely between what Frege's actual Platonism versus Plato's, despite the previous quotations. And one involves sort of, or I guess the main distinction would be sort of between what we might call like sort of the metaphysical Platonism versus kind of logical Platonism. So I have this quotation from Stang to first introduce this um, and just show like, oh, this isn't just like some random crazy thing, but rather around the time of Frege and a little bit before, we see like with Litze, where they're conceiving of Platonism, but not in terms of like, oh, these literal objects that are floating around in heaven that are like eternal and you can't see them. Likewise, then we see with Rec, he makes this distinction between like, Platonism A versus a Platonism B. And so Platonism A is going to be um, more like this metaphysical kind, where we're talking about objects in the way Plato's talking about it, whereas B is going to be more in the sense of logical objects that are understood or defined in terms of more logical role. And he, says three qualities of this, or three things that would distinguish between these two kinds are going to be, one, a certain way of understanding objecthood, two, an explanation of truth and objectivity as correspondence, and three, the resulting problem of the access or the possibility of fundamental mistake, even if our normal arithmetic is consistent. And basically, just what he's talking about here is like, you know, if you're the distinction between Platonism's A and B is going to be certain metaphysical theses, right, about the nature of truth, whether or not it's correspondence. Because if just name one of the three, do you an example of one of the three, right? Because if you're thinking of objects as floating around, or as like Platonist objects as floating around, similar to real objects, then a sentence is true whether or not it correctly like corresponds to those objects or relate to those objects. Whereas if you're going to conceive it more of like a logical fashion, then truth isn't necessarily going to have this kind of reference or this kind of corresponding to those objects in the same way, right? And then again, like referring to this B Platonism, um, then Stang clarifies that it begins with a conception of objective judgment, understood not as judgment, that corresponds to or matches to some metaphysically independent standard, right? And the standard being the objects in the world, but rather obeying these kinds of logical laws internal to judgment itself, right? And so then this is going to be sort of how we distinguish this kind of logical Platonism as opposed to a metaphysical one. And so given this clarification or the specification or distinction made by Stang and Reck, um, and early on by like Litz and others, it wouldn't then now we might be inclined to think go to the other extreme and say, oh, actually no, Frege is not at all like Plato, and so it would be wrong for us to apply any of Aristotle's stuff against Plato to um, Frege. However, even and we'll get to more specifically Aristotle in a moment, but even ignoring that, just internal to Frege, despite the fact that he would at least like to be thought of as a logical Platonist as opposed to a metaphysical Platonist. Even then, just taking logical Platonism, that is going to require us to assume some kinds of metaphysical theses. Probably one example is going to be just the existence of the Julius Caesar problem, and basically, for those who are unaware, the Julius Caesar problem basically being how, like, we're going to want to have our definitions of numbers be such that, we include everything that is in fact a number, but exclude everything that is in fact not a number, right? So, like, if your definition of numbers when, doing mathematics or philosophy of mathematics, includes or counts Julius Caesar as a number, then, like, clearly, something's wrong. You know, and the reason why then this presupposes some kind of metaphysics is the fact that in order to see that as a problem at all, you need to already have the knowledge that, oh, there's Julius Caesar is in fact not a number, or that there's a meaningful distinction between Julius Caesar and, the set of all the real numbers, whatever. And so, as basic as it may be, just the fact of recognizing that Julius Caesar is not a number requires some basic a modicum of, metaphysical insight. Um, More, I think, a bit more technical, we see in this sort of, again, came up with when I was talking about Rec, about one of the distinguishing marks of, B Platonism or logical Platonism versus A Platonism or metaphysical Platonism is that there's sort of this correspondence theory of truth, or this way of thinking about truth. Because if you're going to take this more, Fregean, logical Platonist route, then you're going to have to say, oh, like, um, the truth is not, or our theory of truth is not a correspondence theory. And if you want to then argue about whether or not that is in fact the right theory of truth, right, you're not going to then be just like you wouldn't be able to argue that about that within purely logical mathematical terms. You'd have to provide either, some pre-theoretical argument or some metaphysical argument or what have you about why that is the correct theory of truth. And so in that sense, to then proceed in this logical Platonistic manner then presupposes this metaphysical thesis. All right. Additionally, I also note that another reason why we might think that Frege presupposes some kind of metaphysics is that even just like some of the stuff he works with isn't like necessarily like isn't obviously strictly logical. And like one example being just like sets. Like what to what extent are sets like strictly these like logical concepts? Like of course they're gonna be mathematical concepts, but to what extent are they strictly logical concepts and what to what extent can they actually like it doesn't seem obvious that they can all just be completely derived from um, logic or like don't require some kind of knowledge of other things beyond strictly logic. Anyway, then moving on to the Aristotelian part, right? Because so sort of to summarize what I just said as basically making arguments about why um, within just Frege's own system, within his own thought, we can identify places where there seems to be some kind of metaphysical presuppositions going on. And then now, hopefully, with the Aristotelian arguments against the Platonist thesis, I hope to sort of, well, two things. One, I think they are by themselves just interesting arguments against Platonism generally. But then with Frege, of course, going to be the question of the extent to which they do, in fact, hit the mark, given his special kind of Platonism. But even that aside, them being raised in the first place, I think, shows more clearly the ways in which Frege has to, in fact, presuppose a certain metaphysics, and his inability to argue for such metaphysical presuppositions. Right. And so then the first one I'm going to be talking about is the more like causal argument, basically just the idea that, oh, if you're, Aristotelian, following Aristotle's metaphysics, you're going to say that an object, in order to exist, has to have some kind of causal powers, and it's going to be because of the fact that, if you're, an object, you have act and potency and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not going to go to the minutia of this, since I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea. But basically, you're going to say, oh, but since then Frege says that objects, mathematical objects, they aren't wirklich, they don't have causal powers, and so therefore they can't actually exist. And again, I'm sort of oversimplifying this in part because I myself still want to work out the intricacies of this argument, and specifically how it relates to numbers and the way in which numbers are, might be causes or so on and so forth. And so if you have any particular comments on that, I'd be happy to hear them later on. But at least for now, though, the main point is just going to be that, oh, Frege says that numbers don't have causal powers. If you're an Aristotelian, you're going to say, oh, but everything in order to exist needs causal powers in order to exist. And so therefore these numbers can't exist. They can't be objects. Right. And then if you're going to be a Fregean, then you might be tempted to just say, oh, well, I just disagree with the claim that things need causal powers in order to exist. But then at that point, you've kind of fallen into the real trap, because if you're just doing your philosophy of mathematics strictly in a logico mathematical manner, then you're not going to have the intellectual or the technical means by which to then argue for or against the claim that every object that exists has causal powers. You're just kind of presupposing that, oh, things can exist without having causal powers, in which case then you're just like having to have a mathematical presupposition. And so in that sense, you've failed to, you know, strictly be doing things or in accordance with this logico-mathematical method, right? And yeah, these are just more quotations from the metaphysics that I had pulled. But then thinking ahead, um, and assuming, this doesn't, isn't satisfying enough, which again, given my own lack of understanding of all the intricacies of this, I think that um, more is to be said. But, you know, assuming the causal part isn't enough, then we might also think about um, the nature of sciences in general, and also take this to be another way in which we can Aristotle, or what Aristotle says, can be pointed against what Frege says, right? And so basically going to be this idea that, oh, right, as I mentioned before with Plato, um, that well, part of his concern was like, making sure or grounding these um, mathematical statements and showing that they are in fact able to be true or false, right? In order to do this, we need to presuppose certain mathematical objects. In response to this, Aristotle's going to say, well, actually, all the other sciences, right? Astronomy being the classic example. For all these other sciences, we don't need to presuppose, like, we assume that there's some kind of thing in the world that corresponds or whatever to, or tracks onto these objects, or sorry, these sentences that we're making within the science. But right in astronomy, when we're making astronomical claims, we can make true or false astronomical claims without subsequently then having to assume that there's these kinds of special astronomical objects that exist sort of independently of perceptible objects or beyond perceptible objects. And you can say, oh, if all the other sciences are like this, then why should, or at least the reasoning would go, I was like, oh, if all the other sciences are like this, then why should we think mathematics is really any different? Like, why should we then think, oh, but for mathematics, we need to say that there's like these special objects floating in heaven, different from, like, completely independent of either whether it be perceptual objects or just, substances or what have you. And interestingly enough, I think this particular argument might hit the mark a bit more because in the Foundations of Arithmetic, Frege himself says, here just there are more Aristotelian comments on this, but in the Foundations of Arithmetic, Frege himself says, if in the existing flux of all things there is nothing fixed, eternity persists, then the knowability of the world would end and everything would plummet into confusion. And so it seems as if here that likewise Frege is also justifying his own special Platonism, as different as it be from Plato's, with similar kind of reasoning, namely that, oh, if we don't have these special objects that are independent of, the physical or of other substances or whatever, then we wouldn't be able to have mathematical knowledge, or it kind of what he seems to be saying in the aforementioned quotation. Then it seems though not even like very little would in fact be knowable because everything is going to be in flux, like as perceptible substances tend to be in flux. And so this sense might also, um, from an Aristotelian perspective, disagree with um, or push back against Frege. Right, so here's the affirmation quotation just there. And so, well, then before then I move on to this brief then discussion of Aristotle's conception of science, let me then briefly review the grounds for what I've said, because I feel like a lot of what I'm saying is very either piecemeal or sort of all over the place. So basically what I just did was first, thinking about Aristotle's argument on the basis of causal powers against Platonism, right? Um, and so Frege could potentially object to that argument, or he could deny the claim that something might have causal powers to exist, but in order to even take the discussion in this direction at all, the Frege or the Fregean must commit to certain metaphysical theses beyond what, logicism would permit him to say. Next, then I mentioned or Aristotle's argument on the basis of the nature of sciences, or sort of, I think nature of sciences might be a misnomer, perhaps just like sort of what we need in order to get a science off the ground might be a better way to put it, right? Since it's often argued that mathematical propositions require the existence of substantial mathematical objects beyond physical objects in order to be true or false. Um, However, this doesn't seem to work since other sciences can have true or false propositions without need to having substantial objects, right? That's basically what I've said so far. And so then moving on then, sort of thinking about Aristotle's conception of science, and which I think is ultimately, and I think sort of working on this project more, I might want to bring this part to the beginning to give more general context about what exactly is being argued for, as well as sort of why a more positive reason to favor Aristotle's metaphysical method as opposed to Frege's logical mathematical method, right? Is this conception of science, as, like different kinds of knowledge, right? He talks about this in Nicomachean Ethics, and sort of thinking about um, getting theoretical knowledge of either different aspects of being, or he has this analogy of cutting off slices of being and getting knowledge of that. Again, I won't go too much into this, and I think you're all both relatively convinced of this particular conception and or a bit more knowledgeable probably than myself. But um, right, and it's gonna be knowledge of causes, right? This conception of science and whatnot. And it's gonna conceive of, things almost as nested, metaphysics as being the science of being, qual being, and so on and so forth. Um, yeah. right? And here, I think this is going to be the star quotation right here, um, and how we should think about, or how metaphysics, relating to arithmetic and sort of the work that arithmetician relates to being itself, and sort of how, um, when we're thinking about Aristotle and about his own arguments against Plato, sort of this being in the background. Additionally, I'd also like to note as a side point that when I speak about this Aristotelian conception of science, I think this can at least somewhat be considered independently of the particular Aristotelian theses about what exactly a number is, or whether or not numbers do X, Y, and Z or have X, Y, Z properties, right? And I mention this in part because I think that again, if you're like a Frege or whatever, you're gonna, just to say full on like, oh, you should do this and believe everything Aristotle said is gonna like, that's gonna be like anathema to you. So I say that in part because of that, but to sort of show that, or at least to demonstrate that, or give an example of that, I mentioned Proclus here just because, and if you look at his commentary on Euclid, he very much does sort of borrow from Aristotle and talks about, and I think the second quotation directly from Proclus, very similar to what Aristotle might say about like the nature of science and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he's going to be a Neoplatonist who would disagree with Plato, or not Plato, Aristotle on a number of other specific points about numbers themselves within the philosophy of mathematics, even if more broadly, when he's thinking of his philosophy of science, whereas like, the kind of method he would think about for the philosophy of mathematics is going to be rather similar to Aristotle's. Uh, we can skip that. Now, sort of thinking about then a bit more broadly, or returning more to Frege, sort of just thinking about what exactly the consequences of what what I've been saying is for Frege and for the philosophy of mathematics. Kind of just to rearticulate then the view I'm presenting here, while one might not necessarily be convinced by Aristotle's particular arguments or hold sort of in the Aristotelian position concerning, you know, what numbers are exactly, I think one's going to have some kind of metaphysical argument or some kind of metaphysical presuppositions or make some kind of metaphysical claims if you're going to talk about the metaphysical status of numbers or to really do philosophy of mathematics generally, right? Um, and so then while in trying to show that mathematics is derived from logic, in order to push forward his logicist program, however, Frege doesn't really offer anything which would justify such metaphysical claims, which I've shown that he is required to make. And so therefore, the reduction of mathematics to logic, while it doesn't directly involve metaphysics, um, it still requires a metaphysical framework from which Frege himself can work. At the same time, right, he can only go about undertaking the reduction in the first place if he makes particular, or if he takes particular metaphysical positions. Right. And since they're going to be presupposed, given the fact that he's only working in a logical mathematical way, they're going to lack any kind of, argument in favor of them beyond like, plausibility or like, oh, this seems vaguely plausible or some kind of necessity, the given a certain kind of necessity from his own, his prior beliefs. However, since these metaphysical theses are going to be what's questioned in the first place, um, then he's sort of like kind of begging, and he going to be begging the question if he just sort of sticks to this logical mathematical method, right? And so then this seems particularly concerning since even like the foundations of arithmetic, right, he's concerned with questions such as, what the number one is, right? And so in that sense, it would seem as though he does have some kind of metaphysical, like real metaphysical concerns. And like I think that's like a legitimate metaphysical question, but he himself doesn't have, the necessary tools with which he can even really go about doing such things or go about answering such questions um, in the first place. Right. And I bring up, I think, sorry, I'm just trying to think in my head how I want to articulate this. Or what's interesting as a side note that I'll mention related to sort of Frege's problem that I've outlined here is that sort of there are times when Frege um, talks about numbers and actually starts getting in the nitty-gritty of like how they exist and how they relate, how we have access to them and whatnot. Where like he's forced to use this very um, metaphorical language that isn't as technical as, we might otherwise desire. And I kind of somewhat as because I think um, it's interesting, but I think there's some relevance to it. I have this Wittgenstein quotation about things that cannot be put into words or, what is mystical. And I mention that because, talk about mystical in the sense of like sort of beyond either language or, what have you. And so in this sense, we might say that, Frege, he's trying to capture something that is beyond merely logical mathematical language, namely certain metaphysical truths. And since he's trying to do that, he's forced to say certain things that otherwise sound a bit more poetic or metaphorical, namely like, talking about grasping thoughts. Um, like, the metaphor of grasping is one that he's sort of forced to use in lieu of anything more technical. But again, I don't think this is itself um, an argument that, or an aside that too much hinges on. I just think it's an interesting observation. And so then, right, sorry, from that digression, then sort of get into like the final point where I think that interestingly, right, so Frege has this one line that this is the first quotation where he's talking about um, psychology and whatnot. He looks into a psychological peep show and he says to the mathematician, I see nothing at all of what you're defining. And it's like, oh, of course, mathematician would respond, no wonder, for it is not where you are looking. And I think perhaps then the metaphysician specifically, um, the Aristotelian can perhaps say something similar to Frege himself, um, where the mathematician, right, he's not going to see anything of what the metaphysician is going to be talking about, isn't going to be articulate that, and the metaphysician is going to say, oh, of course, because that's not where you're looking, especially if we might recall this conception or this image that Aristotle gives of different sciences, cutting off pieces of being, where if right, so a certain science will cut off a piece of or an aspect of being and get a theoretical grasp of that, and right, and so then if you're a mathematician, you're getting a theoretical grasp on one aspect of being, then of course, then you're not going to be able to see everything that the metaphysician is talking about, or the philosopher of mathematics is going to be talking about, because that's just like, that's located, so to speak, in a different place. It's not where he's looking. And so then interesting thing then, fill this in mind. And as Dummett notes, this kind of, these more metaphysical things, then we see, quietly vanish from Frege's philosophy, I think, then in part because of everything I've said, namely that there's not going to be any philosophical or specifically metaphysical justification for them. So that's everything, and thank you.
All right, thank you, Sean. All right, so we have just about 5 minutes for questions. So who wants to hop on the queue? Yes, Andrew.
Thank you for your talk. Um, a very small question. You're saying that Frege and Plato and Aristotle's Plato, along with Plato, there's two different kinds of Platonism going on, two different meanings. Um, does Frege's Platonism differ primarily because it asserts a sort of separate, subsistent existence of propositions, of statements out there, rather than like subsisting quiddities? Is that the difference between these two Platonisms?
It's going to be more so in like how they can, right? So like if you're like a metaphysical Platonist, so to speak, yeah, it will be like, the substantial existence of these quiddities or these objects or whatever have certain properties. Whereas I think if you're like a Phrygian Platonist, you're not even gonna like want to say like, oh, like the substantial existence of whatever, like because I think for Frege, ideally, like, you'd be able to understand numbers purely based on their logical role, right? And like the role they'd play within propositions. Um, and that can be understood purely within um, like a sort of like logical linguistic um, context. And so then you can kind of speak of them without even having to refer to like whether or not, predicates really exist. Um, it's kind of like related to like how like, they're going to be like sets, like numbers, defining numbers as sets, and like that's sort of all you need. I don't know, does that make sense?
Okay, so you're saying the difference isn't so much which kind of thing they attribute a subsisting separate existence. You're saying Frege isn't actually attributing a separate subsistent existence to anything. He's just saying
Right.
it's kind of objective and necessary outside of us.
Right. It's like this objective, like necessary kind of thing, but like he wouldn't even want, again, like, right? Because like he denies the correspondence theory of truth. And so like he doesn't even, or wouldn't even want like to think about, oh, these objects, that exist exist substantially outside of us. And then we just have to figure out which objects. Like that's like just like completely irrelevant to this kind of logical mathematical method and for the B kind of Platonism.
Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Well, I think that takes us about to time anyway. If someone has a quick question, you're welcome to squeeze it in. But otherwise, thank you to Sean.
Thank you.